All right, now we get to our final panel of the day, which is AI and emerging technologies, specifically around global governance. So artificial intelligence, digital infrastructure, and other emerging technologies are advancing faster than the rules meant to govern them. Today, there is no single international framework for AI and emerging tech governance. Instead, competing models are taking shape, and the United States emphasizes innovation, the EU prioritizes regulation, and China promotes a state-centric governance tied to digital sovereignty and its digital survival. So this panel will examine how Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean can exercise greater norm-setting power in global AI and emerging technology governance. And the panelists are Dr. Ilia Puyosa of the Atlantic Council, Nate Odula of the Global Connective Center, Fiokule Minyandu of Howard University, and Bulelani Jili of Georgetown University. And the moderator will be Beth Kerley of the National Endowment for Democracy.
Center. Can you hear me?
Last moderator said, yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty good, appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we have already had introductions from Lee and Lynn, so I'm just gonna jump right in for the kind of second conversation of the day, touching on artificial intelligence, everybody's favorite topic. It's everywhere, it's in your students' papers. And we talked a little bit before about the kind of hardware and material inputs, right, behind the current boom and the current competition in AI. So this panel, on which I am really delighted to be joined by a very distinguished group, is going to focus a little more on the side of AI norms and AI governance. So what are the rules that are going to determine how AI is developed, how and where it's used and deployed, data inputs, decision-making, lots of questions around AI governance. Leland mentioned a couple of the different models in play. I'll also just note those aren't, of course, the only games in town. We were looking in the next couple of weeks at the India AI Summit coming up. We also have the UN recently announced its nominations to the International Scientific Panel on AI. So this discussion is going to look specifically at where the Agency of Africa and the Americas fits in to the AI norm shaping conversation. So we're going to do one round of questions kind of focused on Africa and the Americas as normative actors, one round looking at the relationship between Africa and the Americas, and then kind of external vendors and suppliers of AI technologies, especially the PRC, and one round getting some rapid fire policy recommendations from our panel. So I think to start off, for the first round, we will go this way, then we'll switch it up. But starting with Aria. So as Africa and the Latin America and Caribbean region assert themselves more in international governance generally, where do you expect these regions to have the greatest impact on global AI norms? And could think in terms of what type of mechanisms, for instance, legislation, procurement practices, regional coordination are likely to be important here, whether you expect or would like to see more cooperation between these regions, because I know you've worked on both, or if you think there's too much of a gap in terms of values and priorities. How do you see these regions as norm-shaping powers in the AI space?
Thank you, Beth. I certainly see opportunities for collaboration in global governance mechanisms and processes between Africa and Latin America, because there are commonalities and aspirations and needs and demands. Issues like data sovereignty, for instance, issues centering opportunities for digital transformation, economic growth are present in both regions. But there is also some barriers to that collaboration who have to do with different governance approaches capacity weaknesses in different countries. I would say Africa actually have been working a little bit more in continental collaboration, in continental frameworks, using the African Union mechanism, while in Latin America, that in the regional process is still far behind. So Latin America had too many integration, economic and political integrations mechanisms. None of those is strong enough to coordinate all the countries in the region, so that may even more difficult to get to coordination between the two countries. So there are opportunities, but for that opportunity to translate to practice should be some intermediate process in which these two continents start to having those conversations more in depth. So sharing about the common interests and the way to make those interests to be part of the conversations in global forum. Of course, United Nations process, the upcoming AA for Good Summit, for instance, are opportunities for Latin Americans and African countries to be part of the conversation, to have inputs on those global governance issues. But there is also the presence of these two continents in those conversations have been somewhat mediated by China. So particularly African countries and Latin American countries are part of the groupings of the G77, and some of the countries in our regions who are more involved in artificial intelligence governance, like Brazil and South Africa, are part of the BRICS. Those two groupings, who are very influential in the global conversation about artificial intelligence, are led by China. So although China tend to be responsive to some of the demands of the Africa and Latin America, particularly those related with sustainable development, there are other issues who are probably more mediated, but China interests as a leading in those processes, in those two groups who are being really, really influential in shaping global governance of artificial intelligence.
Thank you, Maria, and really interesting point you brought in there. To what extent is China positioning itself actually as the leader, or getting kind of in between African and Latin American countries and the AI norms conversations? So Nate, what are your thoughts on the role of these regions in shaping AI norms?
Well, thank you. Nice to be here. Nate Udofia, representing Global Connective Center, which is a for-profit entity really focused in on the implementation of U.S. government goals and national security interest. In my capacity as the Director General of Global Connective Center Africa, a lot of the work that I do is really looking at a systems of systems approach to how we look at the issue of China and the issue of what's working for China and what's not working, what's working for the Americas, what's not working, and the issues of just demographics and the geopolitical situation means that the region in general is very important. And it has an impact on who's going to win this global trade era, right? And quite frankly, the issue of Africa's sovereignty and the America's sovereignty is at the top of that issue. So we all know in terms of demographically that the continent of Africa in particular is the youngest. And 3 out of 4 Africans at this point are at the age of 25 years of age or younger, right? So if we take a kind of a growth strategy that 2050, the projection is 1 out of every 4 people on the planet will be of African origin. So we need to kind of take the issues of AI and sovereignty and look at it as in a holistic fashion, because what's going to happen is the young people of Africa, and I kind of look back in terms of in my own career, this is phases of development, and this is very similar to when the internet started coming along and people were scared about what effect it was going to have in terms of jobs, what effect was it going to have in certain parts of the world which were already struggling with the issues of divide, right? Health divide, technology divide, digital divide. So in the context of AI and some of the emerging technologies, we can look at it from a perspective of fear, or we can really use it as a tool to really address some of the issues that I've heard through several panels, right? Corruption, right? Can be addressed with AI in terms of government infrastructure and good governance. The issues of transparency, right? In my opinion, the US has an advantage. And that advantage is the technological innovation, right? The spirit of the entrepreneur is I think, something that we need to look at carefully in terms of how we're competing with China and Russia and everybody else, right? For those beloved resources from the region. So if we leverage, for instance, the US government, in particular, the Department of Defense technology, which is 20 years ahead of everybody. Yes, China is catching up, but the US has that advantage. And instead of focusing really on the military power and we can beat up everybody, right? We can't fight everybody. You can't kill all the terrorists, right? So we have to change our approach to more of a partner capacity building approach. You have to look at the issues of workforce readiness. If the infrastructure is going to be going into these regions, traditionally, the complaint has been you bring in technology and you take it back out. It doesn't do anything to advance the local capacity. So if we're looking at competing with China, what can we do? We can build partner capacity to benevolently be able to not have to compete with China, because the way that they compete is not the way that US businesses or even the government gets to compete, right? Because they will put away the rule book and give the country whatever they want, just as long as they can get the contract. So long term, that doesn't serve Africa well. And if Africa is to grow, if Latin America and the Caribbean is to grow, we have to present what we call at GCC strategic corridors that look at the infrastructure ports, the railways, and how do we connect that to facilitate better logistics for that region. So that is the concept of building a strategic corridor that really goes across the Atlantic Ocean, right? And defining partnerships and building capacity within that strategic corridor. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. And I also appreciated the point you brought in there, maybe something that was left off of our list of ways to influence AI norms, and that's the way people choose to use it, presenting positive models of AI to counter corruption and really address issues that are on people's minds in the region. I'm turning now to Fibo.
Thanks everyone. I think I'm from Howard University at the Center for African Studies. Actually, we happen to have and support the largest African languages outside of Africa in the United States by enrollment. So some of the solutions perhaps and pathways that might find expression in our deliberations or recommendations, we are actually at the core phase of it. We're ground zero for some of these solutions. Why? Because languages, the way in which we have thought about languages has hitherto been that things you learn and then things that you speak or you don't. But the Chinese are thinking about languages differently and AI differently. They're looking at African languages as pathways to whole societies. They're also looking at African languages as economic engines for growth whatever you may think comes from a language. To illustrate my point, I did a study because we're always steeped in these AI models. I went to a Chinese LLM and I asked a simple question. Give me one paragraph explaining why Chinese AI is better for Africa. I asked DeepSeek, I asked Gemini, I asked OpenAI. And the answers were instructive. I'm not going to belabor all of them here, but quickly, the Chinese answer said, China-Africa AI cooperation demonstrates strong complementary and strategic alignment. And then it went on to name names. Mechanisms like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, Belt and Road Initiative, and the China-Africa Digital Cooperation Development Plan, etc., etc. Now, it is instructive that none of these names of programs, China-centric programs that I've mentioned, were mentioned or in any of these other LLMs. So, in other words, then, when it comes to AI and education, China doesn't think like we do. It's not thinking about African languages as cumbersome. It's looking at each and every African country and looking at each of that country's languages and the possibilities of that language into AI. And if you think I'm not kind of fibbing here, I went on and asked the Chinese language model, translate what you've just told me in Yoruba. It came back. In Hausa, it came back. Lingala, it came back. And just in case I thought it was kind of like dealing with the big hit languages, I went to an obscure language to all of us here called Oshiwambo, spoken by 1.5 million people. We have no business knowing about this language, but DeepSeek knows about this language. DeepSeek had a succinct answer for this language. And I asked DeepSeek, take it back to Chinese, and DeepSeek took the language back to Chinese. Why? Because it's the largest spoken language in the small country of Namibia. So take that and extrapolate it to every one of the 54 plus 1 African countries. So then my point is, China is thinking about AI as from a strategic lens and then from an educational lens, to the sense that, in other words, it's looking at it as a tool for educating the world, not only about through its universities when people come and learn technology and African students, but also educating the world about Chinese positions on things. So then who designs it, governs it, would be my answer to your intriguing question. So the one that's and I went back and I said, well, put it in Shona, a language I speak very well from Zimbabwe. It did. And then it went, and then it said, it code switched and said, artificial intelligence. So, in other words, DeepSeek, with all the great work they've done, they haven't come up with a Shona word for artificial intelligence. No problem. But guess what? What happens when they find the word for artificial intelligence next week? That means the word for artificial intelligence in the Shona language of Zimbabwe belongs to China. It's been made from China. It comes from China. Take that again and extrapolate it to every language that exists, right? And then you're talking about an old mother in a village somewhere who doesn't bother with these cell phone things in Namibia, but should like to text her daughter in Windhoek. Now she can speak in Oshiwambo and her daughter gets the text, speech to text, you see. That exists right now. So my point then is that this is not by chance. It's part of indeed, it's not even conspiratorial of me. This was part of FOCAC. It was there at the conclusion of FOCAC in 2024. There were 10 action plans that the FOCAC proffered. 1 and 8 of those were completely about soft power. One was about starting 250 centers for Africa, China studies. One, we would surmise then that languages and cultural competencies would be studied there. The other one was, of course, having 60,000 plus, I hope my brother Nantuda is still here, 60,000 plus Africans go to China. So how do we understand or make sense of this then? My question is that I think we should graduate our analysis now to kind of looking at what I call mutuality. Mutuality is, it can either be formal mutuality or effective mutuality. So when China makes a bilateral AI governance deal or agreement with the country, whether that country has high implementation capacity is extremely important for whether or not it's going to follow up on governance. So even if the countries agree, the policy-making elites agree on an AI governance mechanism, that is formal mutuality, great. But I am arguing that we need to also now start looking at effective mutuality, where because country A may lack such capacity for implementation, that mutuality is compromised, and not only that, it transforms that deal or that agreement to being an entirely Chinese agreement and not the country's agreement. So I'll stop there and I'll be able to answer some questions.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you for sharing your sort of primary research that gives us a tangible sense of why the investment that some companies and not others may be making may shape kind of what type of normative AI ecosystem many of the world's people are dealing with. And last thoughts on this question, Dr. Jilly.
Oh, yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you so much for your time and consideration, and thank you to the audience for their attention. So when we're talking about, let's say, AI governance in particular, I would kind of restrict at least my initial comments to kind of 2 points. The first one is on the Brussels effect, and then the second one is on procurement. And so the Brussels effect principally is about the normative exportation of European, I'd say, AI governing models from Europe to Africa, or really to the rest of the world. And when you particularly look at, say, AI-related legislative infrastructure across the continent, you see a general disposition towards its mirroring, I'd say, GDPR-like qualities. And so, you know, if you go across any form of, say, privacy legislation or the kind of the burgeoning emergence of kind of AI policy infrastructure, it disproportionately leverages the language of GDPR. And that's in part because Europe has somewhat positioned its competitive advantage in AI in its legislative infrastructure. And it then has somewhat determined, I'd say, the general global best standard of practice on AI governance. And so when you go across the continent, whether you're picking South Africa, or you're picking Kenya and so forth, you look at the privacy policies or you look at the governance policies related to AI, and it sounds quite similar to GDPR. Now, of course, whether or not that then is expressed in practice is somewhat different, in part because you usually notice that like there's actually usually quite limited capabilities to execute on these kind of legislative infrastructures. And so in particular, Europe has spent a lot of time now trying to then upscale, say, training programs around AI governance. But obviously that kind of, say, analytical departure generally misses what people have started kind of terming African agency, and where you actually see a lot of, at least specifically African involvement around AI and governance is around procurement. And here, when you specifically take a step back and you kind of just look at Africa's digital stack, this is kind of where you see Beijing. In particular, you see it at the base level of the African digital stack, and you actually disproportionately see the US at the top of the digital stack. This basically means that from like the software to the application level, it's disproportionately American. When you kind of look at the data center to the fiber optic cable installation capabilities of Africa, you disproportionately see Chinese-made products. And that partly is connected to how Beijing has kind of, again, leveraged its comparative advantage, which is to say that like it is the manufacturer of the world, and so making commodities, and in particular hard infrastructure is its general disposition. And it has then both manufactured these commodities and then circulated them globally, and again leveraging its kind of its financial weight on doing so. And that's where you see Beijing disproportionately involved in the hard infrastructure of AI in Africa. Now, one of the challenges, again, is to then figure out, well, how much agency does Africa have in then dictating the general use and application of this infrastructure? And that is partly contingent, again, on what they want to use this infrastructure for. And a lot of it is a contingency of the varying degrees of how local constituents want to use it. But usually a lot of the time, it's about capacity building, specifically capacity building around kind of developmental norms and interests. And there, one of the challenges for them is actually about building a capacity independent of Chinese partners. And that's actually where there's a lot of challenges, particularly in terms of, say, for example, building a data center locally that then they can manage over time independently of the technical support that they're receiving from Beijing. And so I would say when we're talking about AI governance, we're either talking about the exportation of the policy infrastructure that's disproportionately coming from Europe, or we're talking about the hard infrastructure that's coming from Beijing. But when we're talking about how that technology is again used, it's very much a contingency then of, well, how are local stakeholders trying to leverage a technology for their own domestic interests while being very much, let's say, dependent on the technical provider for the general application and then maintenance of that kind of technology in the long term. And that's also where you'll find, I'd say, the questions about African agency in particular.
Thank you so much for bringing in the kind of different dimensions of what we're talking about when we talk about AI norms, and especially the question of procurement, which I think is very important. I'm told the word puts people to sleep sometimes, but I don't believe it. And that actually leads us very well into our next set of questions, for which I suggest we go back along in this direction, so back to Theo. And that is the question of thinking about these technological and political dependencies around AI. So that has come up in a number of these comments, the kind of risk that when you do predominantly have the influence of external powers as suppliers, they can dictate terms in various ways and kind of hollow out safeguards in deals, or perhaps gain disproportionate long-term levers. So what concerns do you have in that area, and what steps also would you recommend that countries in Africa and the Americas take to address problems in terms of long-term dependency risks? Going to Fiwa now.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be, first, African countries need to know who they are, and they need to, or we practitioners or scholars need to be able to help each African country be able to know its capacity, its level of implementation. Proffer kind of, the Chinese are ever the ones for classification of countries, right? Each African country, partnership, strategic partnership, comprehensive partnership. In fact, South Africa, my country, it was just upgraded in 2024 to all-weather strategic partnership for a new era. We are never none the wiser except for the documents of what that really means, the difference between them. But my point is, at least it was transparent for South Africa. We could find the documents, but you couldn't find the documents for the Zimbabwe Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. So I'm not going to mention other names. So I would recommend that one of the solutions is to kind of make a determination between three types of countries. Those are your high implementation capacity countries, the HICS, moderate implementation capacity countries, and the LICs, low implementation capacity countries. That way then, because I would argue that's actually how also Beijing views these countries. So it has a very graduated analysis, almost helicopter type analysis of each country. That way then the discussion kind of graduates from China, Africa, AI governance to China, African low capacity countries. We may need to find new terms. The Africans are sensitive, my people. They may not like the low capacity term. It doesn't matter, but the point is we need to be able to then tailor-make some of these recommendations to these countries. For example, with South Africa, since South Africa need not have that as many recommendations as, for instance, Malawi, because South Africa, which much to the consternation of their Chinese interlocutors. When I go to China, every time the scholars remind me, we always agree on paper, but when you guys go back to South Africa, your government just does whatever it wants. Well, that's because it goes under judicial review in South Africa. there is a very robust media in South Africa. You know, if there's something that has been decided, it will go under a review. Unfortunately, then that's not how other countries would, in the region even, would go about doing things. So having a system that accounts for those asymmetries in capacity, I think, is a good place to start.
Thanks. And with my net hat for a second, I'll say this showcases kind of the importance of functioning democratic institutions to democratic governance to kind of robustly assert some of these safeguards. Same question.
Well, I think that the issue starts really with the procurement process. That's where these countries can really take a look at the things that they're looking to get. What are the priorities of that particular nation? And part of that is you define that through your procurements. So if you want to, in effect, you want to build the digital governance backbone, starting with the federal government, and then moving down to state and localized government with a real training, capacity building on how you leverage the procurement system to get the right outcomes on your critical infrastructure projects. It is clear to anybody that spends time looking at logistics across, the world, 90% of container traffic has to touch an African port. 60% of the container traffic has agriculture and food items. So building the capacity of importing nations, right, is part of that scenario. So there's been billions of dollars that have been put into procurements, and the outcomes haven't been there. So we need to design the AI infrastructures in partnership with the countries that we call our allies, because quite frankly, there is right now, there is this this question, and this open question: are U.S. national security interests, in particular, in the best interest of the nations that we're talking about? So, if we're honest with ourselves, we have to do things a little bit differently, and we have to get better results, right? That's built on a shared interest model with the stakeholders on the other side.
Thanks very much. And then, Aria, your thoughts on this question of dependencies, and also especially because I know you've worked a fair amount on China's digital footprint in the global south. So what are some red lines that you think governments should draw to avoid dependencies or other risks when dealing with PRC firms?
Yeah, China has become a provider of technologies for many countries in the global south. We saw that in Africa, we saw that in Latin America, and it's actually in the different layers of the technology. So China provides fiber optic for internet connectivity, and on top of that fiber optic, we will get the building of the data centers, which we need for the artificial intelligence deployment, and they also provide applications systems for running different government functions or different private economy functions. So it's in all levels. The colleague at the end was talking about the issues of the dominance of Chinese technology at the base. In the issues of connectivity and the issues of how the backbone of the digital industries are built, and he mentioned in the United States dominance on the applications, but that's I guess he was meaning about the consumer-oriented applications like social media, for instance. But there are other kind of applications where China is dominating in Africa and Latin America. Like, for instance, one area in which I've been working for a while is all the issues about safe cities, or I prefer to call technologies for surveillance. So all these applications who are used for law enforcement or for urban planning or for connecting different services the governments provide to their citizens. So all those China have been able to negotiate contracts to supply provide this kind of infrastructure to many countries around the world. And I was mentioning in the previous panel how part of that ability to connect with governments and the clients had to do with the way China is a good provider for authoritarian countries who want to control populations. So that is part of the issue, but another part of the issues is the way China look at the issues of digital transformations and the need for economic growth with the countries from the global south had. So China provide all those things. He listened to the needs, the demands of those countries in these different realities: law enforcement, population control, delivery of government services, opportunities for digital transformation. But it also had a string attached. So it had issues which had to do with who controlled the data, and this is an issue which is way important for African countries. They go to the particular civil society in Africa tend to put a lot of emphasis on the issues of data governance and of how the data is localized, how the data is transferred to other countries. So when we go to issues of dependencies, what is important, what are the red lines, had to do with that. Who controls the data? Where the data is stored, what the provider of the infrastructure had the right to process that data for other purposes besides the one who was contracted for. Why the government or the industry or is in a local country is able to use this data for other things, what is the so the way to solve those issues with the data had to do with and solve the issues of dependency you are looking at is try to build in the contracting safeguard about audits of the systems. Who is going to do the independent audit of the system? Transparency on the contracts. The issue of building open source models who allow to connect with different providers, with different vendors. So all these details in the way the contracts are defined and the way the contracts are supervised and the accountability of the whole process is where the countries has an opportunity to keep control of the technology and to keep control of the data in which this control is built on. So because that is the center of everything. The service can be wherever you want, but it's a service that's capturing data, it's processing the data, and who is the ability to decide what to do, where to locate the data, how to process that, and decide who had access or who doesn't have access to the way that is processed is where the risk and the opportunity to control those risks is.
Thanks for underscoring here that the conversation around AI does really depend on the conversation also around data and the norms and governance that are in place, especially when we're talking about, as you say, surveillance technologies. Dr. Gili, you are also an expert on the proliferation of China's surveillance technologies. So your thoughts on kind of ground rules and safeguards when dealing with PRC companies?
Yeah, sure. So, okay. So I will let's underscore this point about procurement, and then I will at least try and speak to a bit about some of the challenges surrounding Chinese surveillance. And then I will try and at least wrap it up in terms of a point about safeguards, specifically thinking about like data governance, safeguards, and so forth. So when we're thinking again about how did all of these Chinese technologies, all the way from, say, the fiber optic installation to, say, facial recognition systems end up in China, from China into African markets? As partly a contingency of, the tendering processes or the kind of the procurement processes that are there locally. But it also is greatly contingent on what China has been kind of using as its principal financial mechanism for the proliferation of its technologies as kind of its pre-negotiated concessionary loan system. So basically, when you're, an African country trying to say, for example, procure a new data center or procure, say, a facial recognition system from Huawei, usually what happens is that even before the opening of the tendering process or the opening of the procurement process starts, where you can basically try and get a vendor from, say, the United States or a vendor from Germany, you actually get an opportunity to get a loan from Beijing. And usually when Beijing is offering this loan, they will then restrict your means of working with a partner based on whether or not it's a Chinese firm or not a Chinese firm. And so basically they'll say, you can only work with 5 or 6 of these Chinese potential vendors, which then means if you're, if a country who wants to build out a new facial recognition system, you'll most likely work with a Chinese partner simply because of the financial reachability of the product. Not simply only because the technology might be a bit cheaper, which is a general contingency of like the industrial capability of Chinese firms, but also generally that the wages of certain technicians are a bit lower, but also because you are getting a loan from Beijing to procure the system. And then once the kind of the system is in place, there's a general disposition of like, I'd say an over-reliance, not simply on the Chinese infrastructure, but also in reliance on kind of Chinese technical personnel in the installation and then the general overall maintenance of the system on the continent. And this is also true specifically with the leveraging and using of surveillance infrastructure. And so a part of the questions surrounding, say, building independent capability is also simply a question of, how can you be independent when majority of your general infrastructure is from one supplier? And one way in which you could do it is by trying to build more, say, hybrid cyber environments, i.e. your procurement is more diverse than simply a reliance on 1 or 2 vendors coming from Beijing. And that then has to get into questions simply of financing and procurement and how it's going to be done in the long term. And then when we're thinking about general safeguards, one of the things that are particularly important is simply about, where's the data stored and what are the kind of legislative infrastructures that govern the general flow and circuits of your data. And one of the challenges specifically on the continent is simply about building capability in terms of the management of that data, both in terms of the general infrastructure, but also simply about the kind of the legislation that goes about managing it. And then when we're talking at least finally about how to go about building that capability locally, building out a capability will most likely be a kind of a collaborative effort in terms of within the academy, within kind of civil society, but also potentially within the kind of the private sectors in terms of kind of having a broad-based collaborative strategy about how to go about thinking, how do we either build, say, capacity in terms of our legislative framework, or in terms of, in the long term, how do we ensure that the data centers that we're building here are the best and secure, and also in particular, how do we ensure that we are fine with some degree of dependency, in part simply because we're not going to be able to do everything. And so how do we ensure that say, for example, our national biometrical data is here stored in this local data set, but then we're also totally fine with, say, different kinds of data being located elsewhere offshore. And so it will most likely come from a kind of a strategy of interdependence, and then also a strategy of prioritization.
Wonderful. Thank you for so many of these points. I can't keep track of all of them, but the all of society nature of the challenge, I think, incredibly important. The kind of, okay, not everything can be independent, right? Lots of conversations around AI sovereignty, but what's realistic for many types of countries. And then the tie into the conversation that we were having earlier this morning about the financing element and the role that plays. So if anyone in the audience has a question, we welcome all questions. If this is actually more of a comment, stop, do not pass go, do not collect $200, but questions are welcome. And please head up to the microphone. And while you do, I'm going to go back to the panel for one last lightning round, which I apologize, but as we're running low on time, please keep this to 1 or 2 minutes, no more. And that is one recommendation that you would like to make, either for U.S. diplomacy, U.S. digital and AI diplomacy to show governments and societies in the regions where you work that the U.S. is really ready to be a partner in AI, or a recommendation that you would like to give to governments in Africa or the Americas to help empower people and preserve agency in the AI era. I think for this one, we will go Dr. Jilly, Dr. Nandu, Mr. Udovia, Dr. Payosa.
I strongly recommend basically working around local capacity building efforts, specifically at the level of data governance. It's very difficult to, for example, tell another government to try and invest in the hard infrastructure of another government, in part just simply because of the budgetary constraints, right? And so if you're thinking about impact, supporting kind of data governance capacity building locally is incredibly important. And then also supporting your own kind of corporate actors help further diversify the kind of vendors that are operating locally is incredibly important. So kind of creating incentives for the general interventions, say, in kind of helping diversify kind of access to data center resources is incredibly important. And then I'd say maybe lastly here, one other kind of important element is simply helping around governance and norms. So in particular, supporting local efforts around transparency, efforts around let's say what I, at least in my own work, have been calling kind of regional coordination, in part just because the most important thing about scaling the general impact of AI for your development will be contingent on the quality of data, but also the amount of that data. And in particular, the continent thus far does not have a lot of data harmonization policy infrastructure yet. So ensuring that the data can circulate across the continent, so that's where you can really use these powerful LLMs to solve kind of collective problems. And so in terms of kind of helping regional institutions better themselves in terms of leveraging the kind of harmonization of data efforts would be quite important.
Great recommendations. Next.
Yeah, I would say we need to conceive of an African Palantir. Yes, we do. We need to disabuse ourselves of the American compunction to want perfection, to want a perfect AI, a very fair AI, because the other side is not thinking like that. The other side is thinking about market share, the future, the language, and remaking the language. And what's discomforting for someone like, is that some of these African languages, the best work was done by American, taxpayer dollars, American, NGOs, American churches in the 19th century translating the Bible into Oshiwambo. Well, that's AI. That's going straight into, the deep seek, and the money is not coming to the US. Nor are all the deliverables that fall from such a tree. So we shouldn't let a perfect AI get in between us participating in a good AI. We do have stories already that two 24-year-olds started this Terra Industries. Terra Industries, which is an African defense. We never thought that this could happen, and they raised money very quickly. So the American industry and should look into collaborating more with on an interdisciplinary level to be able to gain back the ground and take seriously African languages, that they're no longer just things that you talk, but the things that I've said that they are. What I like usually when I go to China is that, one, how freely the students talk and how freely the debates are, even when you're at Peking University. And and then two is meeting African students. And my brother Antula was talking about this. You get to see who's going to run the African countries, 15 years from now. Who's going to be making the policy? And at Hangzhou, which is like top university now, I always tell my brothers and sisters, hurry up, because I don't think the Chinese will be letting you into these good universities in 20 years. Right now, it's just academic diplomacy, But the point here is that there's room for growth from the US side, but we must get rid of some holy cows that we've thought about either too.
So we've got the governance angle, we've got the development and outreach angle. Your recommendation, sir?
Well, certainly the procurement side, I think, lays an answer in terms of how you can effectively take policy that is central, or it is developed in the local country's best interest. And then from a US policy perspective, really a deep dive into the workforce side of it, is really how you're able to craft change within the political system that then can affect the issues of corruption. It can then, have the impact of creating an environment, an enabling environment, not just for foreign investors, but the local aspects of there are more people rising toward the middle level in Africa than anywhere on the planet. So that's a tremendous opportunity. And then the last piece of it, I think, is the mobilization of the global African diaspora. We have to engage that community in particular because there's interest in development of Africa, and that's in the Latin America and the Caribbean is the same thing. The pride of these countries is those of us who have had a chance to go outside and to gain the best education, to have access to the best technology, to have, really here in DC, a place where everybody comes to. Every government wants to really negotiate better relationships with the US government in particular, but we have to also use this opportunity. A lot of discussion has been around critical mining sites, right? So we have identified 10 sites in the US that are being developed. There are 5 sites in the Latin America and Caribbean and 18 sites across Africa. So if we map these sites with a very intentional strategic approach to, we go where the minerals are, we build the capacity, then we bring in the technology that can help expedite their growth development pathway. And that way, we now have literally markets that, was said earlier, we can provide off-taker agreements in the defense industry, in the aviation industry, in the space industry, in the renewable energy space, in the battery space, right? We have the ability now to make it strategic so it can go from Africa to Latin America before it lands in the US and vice versa. So these strategic corridors that I keep talking about are meant to facilitate trade and capacity building amongst alliance partners.
And so a more holistic view of the critical minerals challenge. And Aria, bring us home.
For Latin American and African countries, even though they are not in the room, I would recommend for them to focus on strengthening their regulations and data governance, and make sure in the procurement and contracting of these technologies, there are real opportunities for real knowledge transfer and capacity building at the local level. But for the U.S. administration and companies, I think the most important thing is, two things. One is about framing. What we keep hearing here in Washington, D.C., and the conversation is about outcompeting China and winning the global competition for technology with China. You go to talk to a government in Latin America, the Caribbean, or Africa about how you want to make a deal for outcompeting China, you really are not talking to anybody. So it's not in the interest of those countries for the United States to win the great competition for economic dominance. So change the conversation. Look at what China does. China talk about sustainable development. China talk about economic growth. So China talk about digital transformation. That resonates with the governments of those countries. That take the conversation to the table. That is for one. It's kind of the soft part of the conversation, but it's very important because you don't start the conversations. You are not talking about the needs and demands of your customer. And the second point is hard. Is about the financing. We keep saying one of the advantages China had when they enter the technology market is they put the finance on the front. So they have the digital finance, the financing for the digital investment is out there at the first point of the conversation. United States doesn't do that. So in the recent national security strategy, the administration say there are over $1 trillion for making sure United States is going to dominate in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotech. But no fraction of those $3 trillion is specifically focused on making sure the governments of the countries of Latin America and Africa have the opportunity to get long-term contracts to build their technology. So why you do is you don't build the market for those technology. Your product may be better, but if you have no market, it's not going to be the dominant technology. So those two things, change the discourse and talk in the language that your customers want to talk, and put some money on the table in order to build that market you want to dominate.
Thank you so much. Change the conversation. I love it. So if I do not see anyone at the microphones, I would like to thank our extremely distinguished and thought-provoking panel. Please join me to thank.